1.1 Introduction. Danish society has roots that reach far back in time. Denmark's history is important to know in order to understand Danish society as it appears today. The welfare state, the political system, the economy, culture, and everyday life are all the results of a long historical development. For most of its history, Denmark has been a power in the Nordic region and around the Baltic Sea, and has consisted of many different population groups, but it has gradually been reduced to a small state with a relatively homogeneous population. The Danish state has existed as an independent state without interruption for more than 1,000 years, which is quite unique from an international perspective. Throughout its long history, Denmark has had several different forms of government. Although all these forms of government have had the monarchy as the form of state, royal power has played very different roles over time. Today, the king is still formally the country's head of state, but it is the elected politicians who hold political power in Denmark. This chapter provides an overview of some of the historical events and periods that have had great significance for Denmark's development up to the present day. It is not a complete or exhaustive history of Denmark. The purpose is to describe the main historical features and trends that are connected to the four central themes discussed in the following chapters: Danish democracy, the Danish economy, Denmark and the wider world, Danish cultural life. Thematic features. When years are given in parentheses after a person's name in the teaching material, they indicate the reign of kings or queens, while the years given for other individuals indicate their lifespan. Examples include Frederick III, 1648 to 1700, who reigned from 1648 to 1670, and Karen Blixen, 1885 to 1962, who lived from 1885 to 1962. 1.2 Viking Age, circa 750 to 1050. During the Viking Age, Denmark was united under one king, and power in the country began to be centralized. The Vikings sailed on expeditions across Europe where they traded, plundered, and settled. It was also during this period that most Danes became Christians. 1.2.1 The formation of the Danish kingdom. The Vikings are often described as brutal warriors, and some of them were. In reality, however, the vast majority of people in the Viking Age were farmers who cultivated the land and kept livestock, or merchants who bought and sold goods. The first known king, Angantyr, already united parts of the area that later became Denmark around the year 700. The word Denmark itself is known from the late 9th century. Dan comes from Danes and refers to the people who lived in the Danish area. Mark means borderland. Denmark was therefore the borderland of the Danes. The first time the name Denmark appears within the country's borders is on a so-called rune stone from around the year 955, erected by King Gorm the Old in memory of his wife Thyra. The word rune stone comes from the fact that the text on the stone is written in runes, which were the written characters of the Viking Age. The son of Gorm the Old and Thyra, Harald Bluetooth, is regarded as the first king to rule all of Denmark, and he was also king over parts of Norway. Harald Bluetooth also erected a rune stone around the year 965. These stones are today located in the town of Jelling in Jutland. To protect his kingdom against enemies, Harald Bluetooth built a number of ring fortresses around the year 980 in different parts of the country. Many of these, for example Aggersborg and Fierkat in northern Jutland, Nonnebakken on Funen, as well as Trelleborg and Borgring on Zealand, can still be seen in the Danish landscape today. These military installations were large construction projects by the standards of the time. They therefore also tell us that the Danish king at this point had the power to levy taxes and mobilize large amounts of labor. This shows that Denmark was a single kingdom united under one central authority. 1.2.2 The Vikings' contact with the outside world. The Vikings had extensive contact with foreign countries. The development of Viking ships made it possible to travel long distances to trade and settle. Viking ships were both stronger and more flexible than earlier ships. As a result, they could sail on the open sea even under difficult conditions, travel quickly, and also sail up rivers to cities that were not located by the coast. The Vikings traded with the rest of Europe and also had contact with the Arab world. However, not all contact was peaceful trade. In the 9th century, Danish Vikings also went on raids, among other places to England and France, and as far away as Constantinople, Istanbul. During these raids, they plundered monasteries and towns and demanded tribute from the local population. During the expeditions, the Vikings also conquered large areas of land. Some Vikings settled in the areas they conquered, for example in Normandy in France. The Danish king Svein Forkbeard, 987 to 1014, conquered England, where he became king in 1013. His son, Cnut the Great, 1018 to 35, was also king of England and ruled over Norway at the time when the Viking Empire was at its largest. However, this great empire quickly fell apart again. Nevertheless, the Vikings' presence in England has left lasting traces. Among other things, this is because the English population adopted many words from the Vikings' language, Old Norse, which is the predecessor of modern Danish. Modern English is estimated to contain a few hundred words from Old Norse, for example, egg, window, knife, law, and cell. 1.2.3 Asa True. In the Danish area, the inhabitants practiced a Nordic religion called Asa True. This means belief in the Aesir, who were gods. According to Asa True, the world was divided into 3 realms: Asgard, Midgard, and Utgard. The gods lived in Asgard. From there, one could cross the Rainbow Bridge Bifrost to reach Midgard, where humans lived. Farthest away, separated from Midgard by a high fence, lay Utgard, where the enemies of the gods, the giants, evil giants, and their king, Utgard Loki, lived. Central to Asa True is the concept of Ragnarök, which is the belief that the world will one day come to an end and be destroyed. The king of the gods was Odin. He is often described as an elderly man with only one eye and 2 ravens sitting on his shoulders. Among the other gods in Norse mythology are Freya, who was the goddess of fertility, and Thor, the god of thunder and war, who drove across the sky in his chariot. According to myth, this was what people heard when it thundered. Many names of gods from Norse mythology live on in the Danish language, for example, in the names of the days of the week. Wednesday comes from Odin, and Thursday from Thor. Many place names also have roots in mythology. This applies, for example, to Odense. The name comes from Odin's Vi, which means Odin's sanctuary. Tórshavn, which is the largest city in the Faroe Islands, is naturally Thor's harbor. During the Viking Age, Christianity came to Denmark and gradually replaced Asatru. The German missionary Ansgar built churches in Hedeby and Ribe in the middle of the 9th century, and around 965 Harold Bluetooth was baptized. On the runestone he erected at Jelling, it states that King Harold won all of Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian. Harold Bluetooth's Jelling stone is therefore often referred to as Denmark's baptism certificate. 1.3 The Middle Ages, circa 1050 to 1500. During the Middle Ages, the king, the church, and the nobility often struggled against one another for power. Over time, however, royal authority and the church came to be more closely connected. In addition to this development in forms of governance, the Middle Ages were also a period of important innovations, such as the Jutland Law and the worst plague epidemic in Danish history, the Black Death. Furthermore, all of the Nordic countries were united in a single union, the Kalmar Union. 1.3.1 Power struggle between king, nobility, and church. After the death of Canute the Great in 1035, an unstable period followed. A number of Danish kings were murdered, which weakened royal power. For example, Canute the Holy, 1080 to 86, was killed in St. Albans Church in Odense in 1086 by noblemen who were the richest men in the country. The noblemen were dissatisfied with having to pay fines to the king if they did not take part in military service. The murder of the king made it clear that in the future, kings could only rule if they made agreements with the noblemen. These agreements developed into actual contracts, defining how power was to be divided between the king and the noblemen. These contracts were called Håndfæstninger, royal charters. The first Håndfæstning was signed in 1282 by Erik Klipping, 1259 to 86. The last was signed by Frederick III in 1648. It was later annulled in connection with the introduction of absolute hereditary monarchy in 1660 to 61. For over 100+ years after Harold Bluetooth was baptized as a Christian, Christianity in Denmark was subordinate to the Archbishop of Hamburg-Bremen in Germany, over whom the German emperors had significant influence. This weakened the Danish king and thus Denmark's independence. However, during the 11th century, an independent Danish church emerged. It was divided into 8 dioceses, that is, geographical areas administered by the church, with a bishop as the highest authority. In 1103, Lund in Scania, which until 1658 was part of Denmark, received its own archbishop with authority over all of the Nordic countries. The Nordic region thus became an independent ecclesiastical area within the Catholic Church and directly under the Pope in Rome, independent of the power of the German emperor. A few hundred years after the introduction of Christianity, the Church had gained great power. It became an important part of everyday life for every person. The population had to pay a tax to the Church called the tithe, because it amounted to 1/10 of the harvest or other production. The church largely determined what people were allowed to believe, how they should live, and what actions were considered right or wrong, sinful. The center of religious life was the town or village church, and by around 1250, as many as 3,000 churches had been built in Denmark. People went to church, among other things, to pray to God or to receive forgiveness from the priest if, in the eyes of the church, they had done something wrong, committed a sin. Forgiveness for sin could often be obtained by paying money to the church, indulgences. The church's mass, worship service, every Sunday created reconciliation between God and humans. Monasteries were also built, where monks and nuns could live the perfect Christian life. Many monasteries also cared for the sick and the poor. The church quickly came to own large areas of land in Denmark, and the Catholic Church was an international organization with great influence in Europe. Medieval Danish kings therefore had to ensure that the church was on their side. From the middle of the 12th century to the middle of the 13th century, royal power was renewed and strengthened. That royal power was strong can be seen, among other things, in a number of laws that were created during this period, of which the Jutland Law from 1241 is the most well known. It was now the king who made the laws. The introduction of laws was important for the Danish legal system in the Middle Ages. Previously, families had taken revenge on one another if crimes were committed. The Jutland Law rejected this form of blood revenge. The law also abolished large parts of so-called customary law, which was based on unwritten rules. The sentence, "With law shall the land be built," comes from the introduction to the Jutland law. At first, the law applied only in Jutland, but large parts of it were later incorporated into the Danish law of 1683, the first common law for all of Denmark. Especially in the 13th century, Danish kings carried out several crusades. These were military actions in the area around the Baltic Sea aimed at converting pagan peoples, that is, non-Christian populations, to Christianity. One of the most famous crusades took place in 1219 to Estonia. It is said that during a battle near Tallinn, the Dannebrog fell from the sky and ensured that the Danes won the battle. 1.3.2 Plague, Reconstruction, and the Kalmar Union. From the middle of the 13th century, Denmark was marked by division and civil war, which intensified in the first half of the 14th century. King Valdemar Atterdag, 1340 to 75, succeeded in reuniting the Danish kingdom and rebuilding the Danish state power. During Valdemar Atterdag's reign, the plague known as the Black Death raged. The plague struck Denmark and the rest of Europe around 1350 and killed up to half of the population. The tragedy, however, strengthened the king's power as he confiscated much of the land that had belonged to those who died from the plague. After Valdemar Atterdag's death in 1375, his daughter, Margrethe I, gained power in the country. Margrethe also succeeded in becoming regent of Norway, which at that time also included the Faroe Islands, Iceland, and parts of Greenland. In 1397, she united Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, which at that time also included Finland, in a union with Denmark as the dominant power. This union was called the Kalmar Union because the Union Treaty was signed in the Swedish town of Kalmar. The Kalmar Union was finally dissolved in 1523 when Sweden broke away permanently. Norway remained in union with Denmark until 1814. 1.4 The Reformation, Swedish Wars, and the introduction of absolute monarchy, circa 1500 to 1700. With the Reformation in 1536, Protestantism was introduced in Denmark. At the same time, this meant that the king's power increased significantly. The church, that is, the Christian religious institution, was placed under the authority of the king instead of the pope, and the king took over the church's property. 1.4.1 The Reformation. In the Middle Ages, the Danish church was part of the Catholic Church, which was directly under the authority of the Pope in Rome. The church in Denmark was therefore relatively independent of the king. The church was a wealthy and powerful institution, but around the year 1500, its power was challenged by several movements that sought to reform the church. These movements were called Protestant. One of them was led by the German monk Martin Luther. The uprising led large parts of Northern Europe to break with the Pope. Instead, independent Protestant churches were established in close cooperation with the local kings and princes. Martin Luther's ideas reached Denmark in the 1520s. It was especially the priest Hans Tausen, 1494 to 1561, who spread them. These ideas primarily argued that salvation could only be achieved through faith and not through good deeds or by buying indulgences. The debates about Christianity quickly developed into a popular uprising directed against the wealthy and powerful Catholic Church. In 1534, civil war broke out in Denmark between the Catholic authorities of the Church and the supporters of Protestantism. Under the leadership of Christian III, 1536 to 59, the Protestants won the Civil War in 1536. In the same year, the Reformation, that is, the religious transformation of the Church, based on Martin Luther's Protestant teachings, was formally carried out. Denmark became a Protestant country, and the king dismissed the Catholic bishops. The Danish church now came under the authority of the king instead of the pope. The Reformation greatly reduced the political power of the church. The Catholic Church had owned great wealth and large amounts of land, and all of this was now taken over by the king. At the same time, he closed the monasteries. Until then, the language of the church had been Latin, which only few people understood. Martin Luther believed that everyone should have access to Christianity in their own language. The Reformation therefore meant that the Bible was now translated into Danish, and church services and hymn singing were from then on conducted only in Danish. The Reformation also meant that only the king could appoint priests and bishops. In this way, the church could now be used to strengthen royal power, and with the translated Bible, a common Danish written language spread to all corners of the Danish kingdom. In the long term, the Reformation had decisive importance for Denmark's history because it closely linked the state, the church, language, and the population. In the short term, it marked the beginning of a strong state power that in 1660 to 61 developed into royal absolute monarchy. 1.4.2 Christian IV and the Swedish Wars. Christian IV, 1588 to 1648, was king for almost 60 years and thus reigned longer than any other monarch in Danish history. He is also one of the most significant Danish kings. Like other rulers of his time, he had a great interest in art and architecture and was responsible for a large number of construction projects. In the first half of the 17th century, he had many buildings constructed, especially in and around the capital, Copenhagen. Among the most famous are Frederiksborg Castle near Hillerød, the Copenhagen Stock Exchange, as well as Rosenborg Castle and the Round Tower in Copenhagen. He also founded several new towns, mostly outside present-day Denmark, such as Kristianstad in Scania, Kristiansand in Norway, and Christiania, which is now called Oslo and is the capital of Norway. However, Christian IV's reign was also marked by lost wars and lost territories. When he came to power, Denmark was the dominant power in the Baltic Sea region, but Sweden also had great ambitions in the area. The balance of power between Denmark and Sweden changed significantly when Christian IV threw Denmark into the 30 Years' War in the year 1625 to 29, a major European conflict that primarily took place in Germany from 1618 to 48. The king suffered a major military defeat in 1626, and when Denmark withdrew from the war in 1629, Sweden had become the leading power in the Baltic region. Poor relations with Sweden continued throughout the rest of Christian IV's reign. In 1643, Denmark was attacked by Sweden, and in 1645, Denmark was forced, among other things, to cede the province of Halland for 30 years, the island of Gotland in the Baltic Sea, and parts of Norway to Sweden. By the time of Christian IV's death in 1648, Denmark was a country in deep crisis, and Sweden's dominance over Denmark was to last for the remainder of the 17th century. In the years 1657 to 60, Denmark was once again at war with Sweden on 2 occasions. During the first of these wars, the Swedes conquered large parts of Denmark, which, in the peace treaty signed in Roskilde, the Peace of Roskilde in 1658, Denmark was forced to cede permanently Scania, Halland, and Blekinge, as well as several Norwegian territories, to Sweden. Bornholm was also ceded to Sweden in the same treaty, but the island's population quickly launched a rebellion and overthrew Swedish rule, so that Bornholm once again became Danish. Later the same year, the Swedish king regretted that he had not conquered all of Denmark. Once again, war broke out, and the Swedes besieged Copenhagen, that is, They surrounded the city to force it to surrender. However, with help from the Netherlands, the Danish capital managed to withstand the siege, and the Swedes failed to conquer any further Danish territories. Likewise, the Swedes had to accept that Bornholm would remain Danish. The loss of so many territories had major consequences for Denmark. It meant a great loss of population, fertile agricultural land, valuable trade, and a long coastline along the Baltic Sea. Denmark no longer controlled both sides of the Øresund, which is the entrance to and exit from the Baltic Sea. From this point on, Denmark was no longer a major power in Northern Europe. On point 4.3, the introduction of absolute monarchy. In the wake of the lost wars against Sweden and the country's poor economy, demands grew among the population to abolish the special privileges of the nobility. The nobility consisted of nobles who were typically large landowners and enjoyed a number of privileges. For example, they did not have to pay taxes. They could choose who would become the new king when a monarch died, and they could also, through a håndfæstning, royal charter, force the new king to share power with them. In October 1660, King Frederick III, 1648-70, introduced a decision that the nobility would henceforth have to pay taxes, among other things, to help rebuild the country after the wars against Sweden. The nobility, which had not been of much help during the war, also had to accept that royal power would from then on automatically be inherited from the reigning king to his closest heir. The king used his new power in 1660 to 1661 to introduce a new form of government in Denmark, known as an absolute monarchy. The king now ruled the country entirely on his own. He could appoint officials, enact laws, and levy taxes without first asking anyone else for permission. A true central state administration was established. As the only absolute monarchy in Europe, Denmark received a written constitution in 1665. This law was called the Kongeloven, King's Law, and primarily established that the king possessed almost unlimited power. The Kongeloven placed only very few limits on what the king was allowed to do. He was not permitted to relinquish his absolute power either fully or partially, nor was he allowed to divide the kingdom among his children. Instead, it had to be inherited as a whole by the heir to the throne. Finally, he was required to belong to the Protestant Church, which had been created by the Reformation in the 16th century, based on Martin Luther's teachings. The Kongeloven remained the foundation of the king's absolute power all the way until the first democratic constitution in 1849. 1.5. A maritime nation and colonial power from circa 1620. In the 17th and 18th centuries, Denmark, like many other Western European countries, became a colonial power. This meant that Denmark acquired territories outside Denmark and declared them part of the Danish realm. Denmark built forts on the Gold Coast, on the west coast of Africa in what is now Ghana. From there, a total of more than 100,000 enslaved people were transported across the Atlantic to the Danish colonies in the West Indies, the Caribbean, St. Thomas, St. Croix, and St. John. On the Danish West Indian Islands, enslaved people were forced to work on sugarcane plantations or in the homes of European plantation owners. The sugar was transported to Copenhagen, where it was sold either in Denmark or abroad. The slave trade was banned from 1803, but until 1848 it was still legal to keep enslaved people on the islands. Denmark also established trading colonies in Tranquebar and Serampore in present-day India. From there, Danish ships could transport spices, saltpeter for the production of gunpowder, cotton goods, and other valuable commodities to Europe. From 1721, Christian missionaries arrived in Greenland with the support of the Danish king. The first was the Norwegian priest Hans Egede, In addition to the goal of converting the Greenlandic population to Christianity, another aim was to sell goods from Greenland, such as seal skins, blubber, and whale meat. Denmark sold its colonies in India and Ghana to Great Britain in the mid-19th century. The Danish West Indies was sold to the United States in 1917 and are today known as the U.S. Virgin Islands. Greenland now has self-government, but is still part of a so-called realm community with Denmark, together with the Faroe Islands. 1.6. The Age of Enlightenment and the Road to Democracy, circa 1700 to 1849. The Enlightenment in 18th century Europe was a period marked by major changes. It was based on the belief that through education, tolerance, and critical thinking, people could become freer and better individuals. Reason was meant to lead to freedom for the individual. Such ideas also reached Denmark. The growing bourgeoisie in the towns demanded a share of political power and began to challenge the absolute monarchy. 1.6.1 The Stavnsbund and the Agrarian Reforms. In the first half of the 18th century, Danish agriculture was in economic crisis. To ensure a stable supply of labor on the estates, the king introduced the Stavnsbund in 1733. The Stavnsbund meant that all peasants who made up the majority of the population were required to remain on the estate where they were born until the age of 40. This guaranteed the landowners a stable workforce. In return, the landowners had to provide some of their peasants as soldiers for the army. At that time, most peasants in Denmark were tenant farmers, feastebønder. This meant that they lived on one of the landowner's smaller farms. Tenant farmers had to pay rent to the landowner and perform unpaid labor on the landowner's fields to increase production on the estates. Toward the end of the 18th century, the ideas of the Enlightenment gradually began to take hold in Denmark. Among other things, a series of reforms were carried out in agriculture and in the living conditions of the rural population. The agrarian reforms, which played a major role in the development of both Danish agriculture and Danish society, led to agriculture in the course of the 19th century, developing from a medieval system with tenant farmers into a more modern agricultural system with freeholding farmers. From 1788, the Stavnsbund was abolished. Its abolition meant that tenant farmers could choose for themselves whether they wanted to remain on the estate to which they belonged or move away. An important result of the reforms was also that peasants were allowed to own land themselves. In many cases, landowners sold the land to the peasants who had previously rented it. In many instances, the village's common land was also divided among the individual farms. In this way, each farmer gathered his fields in one place, making the land more efficient to cultivate. Previously, farmers' holdings had been clustered together in villages. Now, many farms were moved out of the villages and onto the farmer's own land. This relocation of farms still characterizes the Danish landscape today. Although the agrarian reforms improved conditions for tenant farmers and freeholders, life in the countryside remained hard. A rapid growth in population during the 19th century meant that many peasants could not obtain their own farm. As a result, the rural underclass grew as the number of smallholders, husmænd, increased. They typically lived in small houses and had only small plots of land to cultivate or to keep a few animals on. Therefore, they most often worked as agricultural laborers on nearby farms or estates. 1.6.2 The Florissant Period and the Wars with England. In the last quarter of the 18th century, Danish shipping flourished, and Copenhagen developed into a major international port. This period is called the Florissant Period. Florissant means flourishing. For most of the 18th century, Denmark was at peace and remained neutral in wars. By contrast, the navies of Great Britain, France, and the Netherlands, among others, were used for warfare. At the same time, these great powers blockaded each other's ports and sea routes. As a result, they extensively shipped their goods on neutral Danish vessels, which were able to reach most destinations. The ships carried valuable cargoes to Copenhagen, where they were resold to other European countries. This neutrality trade initially brought large revenues to the country, but in the longer term, it also became Denmark's path into the Napoleonic Wars, which had catastrophic consequences. In Denmark, these wars are also called the English Wars, because Denmark became allied with France in a war against England, Great Britain. The wars began in 1792 as a result of the French Revolution in 1789. In the early years of the wars, Denmark was neutral and profited greatly from its large merchant fleet by transporting goods to both Great Britain and France. The merchant fleet was protected by Denmark's own navy, which Great Britain disliked as it did not want Denmark to trade with France. Therefore, the British Navy attacked and defeated the Danish Navy in 1801. This battle is called the Battle of the Roads, Slaget på Reden, because it took place in the waters just outside Copenhagen's harbor, in the area known as the Copenhagen Roads. In 1807, the French Emperor Napoleon I wanted to wage economic war against Great Britain by blockading trade routes to and from the country with warships. To prevent Napoleon from using Danish ships in this blockade, the British chose to seize the entire Danish fleet and, in the process, bombarded Copenhagen. This event is known as the Bombardment of Copenhagen. After the defeat, Denmark was forced to choose sides and chose France. The Napoleonic Wars ended with Denmark's ally, France, losing to the other European great powers. As a result, Denmark was forced by a peace treaty in 1814 to cede Norway to Sweden. More than 400 years of Danish-Norwegian union since 1380 thus came to an end. 1.6.3 The Road to a Free Constitution. In the 19th century, Denmark was influenced by popular and democratic movements that, among other things, stemmed from the French Revolution of 1789. In 1848, revolutions broke out in many European capitals. No revolution occurred in Denmark, but the unrest across Europe affected the country. In March 1848, the bourgeoisie in Copenhagen demanded that King Frederick VII, 1848-63, introduce a free constitution. Under pressure from the excited popular mood, the king chose to comply with the demand. He abolished the system of absolute monarchy and declared himself a constitutional monarch. This meant that he was to govern in cooperation with the people on the basis of a constitution, the Basic Law. On June 5, 1849, Frederick VII signed Denmark's first free constitution, the Constitution of the Kingdom of Denmark. With the constitution, Denmark established a parliament comprising two legislative chambers, the Folketing and the Landsting, collectively known as the Rigsdag. After nearly 200 years, since 1660 to 61, under absolute monarchs, part of the Danish population now gained direct influence over legislation. Men over the age of 30 could elect members to the Rigsdag. To be eligible for election to the Folketing, one had to be at least 25 years old, while members of the Landsting had to be at least 40 years old and have a high income. Neither women nor the poor had the right to vote, that is, the right to cast a ballot, or could be elected to the two chambers of the Rigsdag. Nevertheless, the constitution was very democratic and liberal compared to the constitutions of most other states at the time. 1.7 The Schleswig Wars, 1848 to 64. In the first half of the 19th century, national consciousness grew across Europe, including in Denmark. At the same time, tensions increased between those who felt Danish and those who felt German within the Danish realm. This led, in the years 1848 to 50, to a civil war between the Kingdom of Denmark and German-minded rebels in the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein, where the Danish king was also ruler. Denmark won the war, but the problem was not resolved. In 1864, the national tensions once again triggered a war. This time, the Germans were victorious, and Denmark lost both Schleswig and Holstein. On point 7.1, the First Schleswig War. In the mid-19th century, the Danish composite state consisted of the Kingdom of Denmark as well as the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein. The Danish king ruled all three parts of the realm. Growing national feeling and democratic ideas created tensions between the Danish-speaking and German-speaking parts of the population. The population of Holstein was German, and many considered it natural that the Holsteiners wished to break away from Denmark and join the German Confederation. In Schleswig, however, there were both Danish-speaking inhabitants who wanted to remain part of Denmark and German-speaking inhabitants who wanted to secede and join the German Confederation together with Holstein. This situation was known as the Schleswig Question. People and politicians on both sides of the border debated where the Danish border should be drawn. In 1848, Schleswig and Holstein were refused their demand for an independent, free constitution for the two duchies, similar to the Danish constitution that was in the process of being introduced. This refusal led to civil war between the Schleswig-Holstein rebels on one side and Denmark on the other. The German Confederation and the strongest of the German states, Prussia, supported the rebels and sent large numbers of soldiers into the war on the side of the duchies. In 1849, Denmark and the Schleswig-Holstein forces fought a number of battles. One of them took place near Fredericia in July, where the Danish army was victorious. In 1850, the German Confederation and Prussia were pressured by Russia to withdraw their auxiliary troops from the conflict. After this, the Danish army won a series of decisive victories, including the Battle of Isted in July 1850. This was the bloodiest battle of the war, with thousands killed and wounded. After mediation by the European great powers, the outcome was that the two duchies were to remain part of the Danish composite state. This solution would prove not to last for long. The 3 Years' War of 1848 to 50 is also known as the First Schleswig War. On point 7.2, the Second Schleswig War. After the First Schleswig War, Denmark had promised the great powers that it would not bind Schleswig more closely to Denmark than Holstein. However, Denmark broke this promise. In 1863, pressured by popular opinion, the Danish parliament adopted a new common constitution for Denmark and Schleswig, but not for Holstein. The German states perceived this Danish Schleswig constitution as a violation of the agreement that had been made. Prussia, whose political leader was the powerful minister-president Otto von Bismarck, therefore, together with Austria, declared war on Denmark in February 1864. This war is known as the Second Schleswig War. Denmark was attacked from the south, and the Danish forces expected that the Dannevirke would protect them from the attack. The Dannevirke was a defensive fortification that had been a strong line of defense since the Viking Age. However, in February 1864, the Danish army had to evacuate Dannevirke in great haste because the opposing forces were numerically superior. Parts of the Danish army withdrew north into Jutland. The main body of soldiers, however, held defensive positions at Dybbøl near Sønderborg. On April 18th, after prolonged bombardment, the Prussians attacked Dybbøl and the outmatched Danish forces suffered defeat. All of Jutland was occupied by enemy forces, and when the Prussians also captured the island of Als at the end of June, Danish politicians had to admit that the war was lost. The defeat of 1864 was a catastrophe for Denmark. Denmark was forced to cede Schleswig, Holstein, and the small duchy of Lauenburg to Prussia and Austria. In a single blow, the Danish king lost approximately 2/5 of his population and 1/3 of his territory, which thereafter consisted of Denmark proper and a number of sparsely populated lands, Greenland, the Faroe Islands, and Iceland, as well as, until 1917, the 3 small Danish West Indian islands. As a result, after 1864, the realm had a more homogeneous population than ever before. The vast majority of the population spoke the same language, lived under the same constitution, and was culturally fairly similar, even though there were still large differences between rich and poor. In the adversity following the defeat of 1864, Danish national identity grew even stronger, and language and culture came to play an important role. Many people from southern Jutland now lived in the German Empire south of the border, but felt Danish. It was not until 1920 that the Danish-minded areas in the northern part of Schleswig were reunited with Denmark. The war and the loss of the duchies in 1864 meant that Denmark was now definitively reduced to a small state with no influence at all on the decisions of the European great powers. In 1871, Bismarck united the German states into a powerful empire, and Denmark now stood entirely in the shadow of its large neighbor to the south. There was great concern that Denmark might be completely wiped out as an independent state. To ensure continued survival, Denmark thereafter sought, at almost any cost, to avoid involvement in international conflicts. In terms of security policy, Denmark chose strict neutrality and maintained only a weak military defense. 1.8. Industrialization and New Political Movements, 1864 to 1914. The late 19th century and the early 20th century were marked by extensive modernization of Danish society. Industrial development gained momentum, prosperity increased, and new political reforms were intended to ensure a freer economy. In domestic politics, a sharp conflict emerged between the landowners' party, Højre, and the farmers' party, Venstre, and a number of new political movements, such as the labor movement, the cooperative movement, and the women's movement, came into being. 1.8.1. The First Industrialization and the Labor Movement. Industrialization began gradually in England as early as the mid-18th century. The most important reasons for industrialization were the development of the steam engine, the first railways in the early 19th century, and access to energy in the form of large coal reserves. The first railway within Denmark's present borders opened in 1847 and ran between Copenhagen and Roskilde. However, industrialization did not truly take hold until the second half of the 19th century, and Denmark did not shift from being an agrarian society to a fully industrial society until after the Second World War. The early industrialization caused large parts of the population to move from the countryside to the cities to work in industry or in crafts. As a result, an entirely new social group of workers emerged. They often worked in the new factories or workshops in the cities and lived in small apartments in large multi-story buildings. The many industrial workers shared common interests. Among other things, they wanted to secure the highest possible wages for their work, reasonable working hours, and better safety at workplaces. The workers began to organize. In October 1871, the International Workingmen's Association for Denmark was founded as part of the International Socialist Movement, which sought to influence workers in many countries. Through newspapers and leaflets, the movement's leaders encouraged strikes and demonstrations to demand better conditions and higher wages for workers. Employers, for their part, insisted on their right to manage and distribute work. The period was therefore marked by strikes and confrontations. The most well-known clash between demonstrating workers and the authorities was the Battle of the Commons, Slaget på Fälleden, which took place in May 1872. It was a large workers' meeting in Copenhagen that ended in clashes between police and soldiers on one side and workers on the other. No one was killed at the Commons, but many were imprisoned. A political workers' party, the Social Democratic Party, also emerged. It was initially part of the labor movement, but became an independent party in 1878. In 1884, the first two Social Democrats were elected to the Folketing. A prolonged conflict in 1899 between employers and workers ended in September of that year with a historic agreement, the September Compromise, between the two main labor market organizations, today known as the Danish Employers Association, DA, and the Danish Confederation of Trade Unions, FH. Under the agreement, employers retained their right to manage and allocate work, while workers gained the right to organize and collectively represent their interests through trade unions and shop stewards, for example, to negotiate wages and working conditions or to strike under certain rules. The September Compromise still forms the basis of how agreements are made in the Danish labor market today. This way of reaching agreements in Denmark is known as the Danish model. 1.8.2 The Cooperative Movement. While industry was growing in the cities, changes were also taking place in the countryside. In the mid-19th century, Denmark exported large quantities of grain abroad. The situation changed, however, in the mid-1870s. Steamships and railways now made it possible for the United States and Eastern European countries to export cheap grain to Western Europe, causing grain prices to fall drastically. As a result, Danish farmers largely chose to shift to livestock production. This meant raising, for example, cattle and pigs in order to produce goods such as butter and bacon, which quickly became Denmark's most important export products. The most important market was Great Britain, which alone absorbed more than half of Denmark's animal-based food exports in the period 1890 to 1914. Part of this success was due to the cooperative movement, which reached Denmark during the same period. The Danish cooperative movement was part of an international movement that had emerged in England in the 1840s under the name the Cooperative Movement. Farmers joined together to establish, among other things, dairies and cooperative retail stores. Through these, they cooperated on purchasing and production and shared the profits in proportion to each member's turnover. At the same time, farmers were able to improve the quality of their products through the cooperative enterprises. A key principle of the cooperative movement was that members voted according to heads, not livestock. This meant that a farmer, a head, who owned only a few animals, livestock, formerly had just as much influence as a large farmer with many animals. Cooperative slaughterhouses were also established, ensuring that farmers had control over both the production and the sale of their meat. The cooperative movement has been of great importance to the development of Danish agriculture and to Denmark as a whole. The democratic principles and the idea of equality that formed the basis of the cooperative idea later became an important part of modern Danish society. Many cooperative enterprises still exist, for example, Coop and Arla, even though most of them have since moved far away from their original foundations, both in terms of size and management structure. The labor movement also established enterprises based on the cooperative idea. These were called cooperative enterprises. Examples included breweries that operated on equal terms with other companies, but which were owned by the workers or consumers themselves. These companies were not meant to generate profits for owners in the same way as ordinary companies. Today, the vast majority of the labor movement's enterprises have been outcompeted by private companies. Point 8.3. The breakthrough of parliamentarism. The War of 1864 was not only a military defeat, but also a political defeat for the national liberal bourgeoisie. The urban bourgeoisie had not only led the struggle for a democratic constitution, but had also promoted the national policy that had drawn Denmark into the war. As a result, the bourgeoisie emerged weakened. This played into the hands of conservative circles supported by the country's landowners. In 1866, they succeeded in passing an amendment to the Constitution that represented a democratic setback. The king and the men with the highest incomes were now given the right to elect most of the members of one chamber of the Riksdag, the Landsting. The somewhat broader right to vote was, however, preserved for the Folketing. The new constitution did not specify how matters should be handled when the Folketing and the Landsting, now elected by two very different electorates and thus representing two different political majorities, could not agree. In the late 19th century, political conflict between the right-wing and left-wing forces in the Riksdag intensified. Both sides believed that the constitution supported their position. The period is therefore known as the constitutional struggle, Forfatningskampen. Around 1870, the opposing sides organized themselves into two political parties, Høyre and Venstre. The party Venstre, which represented the farmers, held a majority in the Folketing, while the conservative party Høyre held a majority in the Landsting. During this period, Høyre governments, appointed by the king and led by the landowner J.B.S. Estrup, passed a long series of so-called provisional, temporary finance acts, even though the government was in the minority in the Folketing. The Folketing, dominated by Venstre, in turn sought to block the government's policies. The result was that all legislative work came to a standstill. Only with the system change, systemskiftet, in 1901 was this deadlock broken and the parliamentary principle introduced. According to the parliamentary principle, it is solely the Folketing that determines who holds government power. Under this principle, a government must not have a majority in the Folketing against it. The year 1901 marked a turning point for Danish democracy. However, the parliamentary principle was not written into the constitution until it was amended in 1953. After long political struggles, Venstre took over government power for the first time in 1901. As Danish society continued to develop, more political parties emerged. One of them was the Social Liberal Party, Det Radikale Venstre, which was founded in 1905 by a breakaway group from Venstre. It was primarily supported by academics and smallholders. 1.8.4. The Women's Movement. It was also in the late 19th century that the struggle for gender equality truly began. The Danish Women's Society, Dansk Kvindesamfund, Denmark's oldest women's organization, was founded in 1871. It played a decisive role in achieving a number of major advances in women's rights up until the 1920s. For example, in 1875, women were granted access to take the upper secondary school examination, studentereksamen, and to attend university. However, the examination had to be taken at private girls' schools until 1903, when public upper secondary schools were also open to girls. In 1880, married women gained the right to withdraw and use their own wages. In 1921, women were given equal access to most public positions, except in the armed forces and as priests. Furthermore, it was at an international socialist women's conference in 1910 at Folkets Hus on Jagtvej in the Nørrebro district of Copenhagen, later known as Ungdomshuset, that it was decided to establish an International Day of Action for Women. From 1921, this commemoration was given a fixed annual date on March 8th, which today is International Women's Day in many countries around the world. A crucial development during this period was that Danish women gained the right to vote. In 1903, they were granted voting rights, but only for parish councils of the national church. From 1908, women also gained the right to vote in parish and municipal councils. Finally, in 1915, with implementation in 1918, the Constitution was amended so that Danish women obtained the right to vote for both chambers of the Rigsdag, the Folketing, and the Landsting. In this way, Denmark followed the trend in other European countries, where women's movements had also pushed to secure political influence for women on equal terms with men. On a global scale, Denmark was among the first countries to introduce women's suffrage in parliamentary elections. With the same constitutional amendment, domestic servants, that is, people without their own household who worked and lived with another family, were also granted the right to vote for both the Folketing and the Landsting. Thus, the right to vote was expanded from covering a minority to encompassing the majority of the population. 1.9 World War, Crises, and Social Reforms, 1914 to 40. From 1914 to 1918, the First World War raged between Europe's great powers. Denmark avoided becoming directly involved. The years that followed were marked by a highly deadly influenza epidemic, as well as political unrest both in Denmark and throughout the rest of the world. Many European countries developed into dictatorships. In the 1930s, the world was struck by a deep economic crisis. Unemployment also rose sharply in Denmark. This triggered many conflicts in the labor market and gave the Social Democratic Party strong public support. It also motivated the established political parties to work together to find solutions, helping to ensure that anti-democratic ideologies never gained significant support in Denmark. 1.9.1 The First World War, 1914 to 18. In 1914, the First World War broke out. The major European powers were drawn into the war. On one side were Germany, Austria, Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, and on the other side were France, Russia, Great Britain, Italy, and later also the United States. Neutral Denmark was geographically close to the war fronts, but was not directly affected by World War I. After pressure from Germany, Denmark nevertheless chose in 1914 to lay mines in some Danish waters. Germany's purpose was to prevent British warships from sailing into the Baltic Sea, and thus threatening Germany from that direction. However, the minefields could also hinder German ships from passing through the Danish straits. One group of the Danish population became particularly involved in the First World War: the Danish-minded inhabitants of Schleswig, south of the border, who had become German citizens after Denmark's loss of Schleswig in the Second Schleswig War in 1864. In total, approximately 6,000 Danish southern Jutlanders died in German military service during the First World War. Denmark's colonies in the West Indies also came into focus because of the war. The United States feared that Germany might occupy the Danish West Indies, and therefore offered in 1915 to buy St. Thomas, St. Croix, and St. John from the Danish government. After a referendum in Denmark, the islands were sold in 1917 for $25 million. In return for the sale, the U.S. government recognized that Greenland fully and completely belonged to Denmark. 1.9.2 The Spanish Flu, Toward the end of the war in 1918, the world and Denmark were struck by a highly contagious and deadly influenza virus known as the Spanish flu. The disease did not originate in Spain, but got its name because Spanish newspapers were the first to report on it. Since Denmark did not take part directly in the First World War, the country was better prepared to combat the disease, with a population that was better nourished and a healthcare system that was less strained than those of many of the warring nations. Nevertheless, the Danish authorities were unable to take any action. Very little was known about the disease, and it was not possible, for example, to develop a vaccine. Many influenza patients also developed pneumonia, which, before the discovery of penicillin in 1928, was often fatal. The Danish Health Authority attempted to advise the population through leaflets on issues such as good hygiene and avoiding contact with others, and some schools and places of entertainment were closed. However, this was not enough to bring the disease under control, and it struck the country in several waves during the period 1918 to 20. A distinctive feature of the Spanish flu was that it disproportionately killed relatively young people. Most of the victims were between 20 and 40 years old. In total, the disease claimed up to 50 million lives worldwide, including approximately 15,000 in Denmark. On point 9.3, the reunification and the constitutional crisis. Germany lost the First World War. This made it possible for Denmark to demand the return of the primarily Danish-minded areas of Schleswig. In 1920, the population of northern Schleswig and central Schleswig voted in two separate referendums on whether they wished to belong to Germany or Denmark. The vote in northern Schleswig took place in February 1920. A large majority voted in favor of northern Schleswig being reunited with Denmark. In the referendum held in March 1920 in central Schleswig, where Flensburg was the largest city, a large majority instead decided that the area should remain part of Germany. On June 15, 1920, the border was formally moved south from the Kongså River to the present border between Denmark and Germany. Northern Schleswig, now called Southern Jutland, Sønderjylland, was thus reunited with Denmark. The return of Southern Jutland to Denmark is known as the reunification. However, there is still a German minority, about 15,000 in 2020, on the Danish side of the border, and a Danish minority, about 50,000 in 2020, on the German side. The rights of these minorities were laid down in the Copenhagen Bond Declarations in 1955, which have ensured peaceful development in the border region. Shortly before the reunification, Denmark experienced its most serious constitutional crisis of modern times, in connection with the Easter crisis, Påskekrisen. Prior to this, King Christian X, 1912-47, and the government had been in disagreement for some time. It was especially the disagreement over the new border with Germany that triggered the Easter crisis. The king believed that the government, despite the results of the referendums, should attempt to regain more of Schleswig for Denmark than just northern Schleswig. The government rejected this. During Easter 1920, Christian X dismissed the government because of this disagreement. This occurred even though the government did not have a majority against it in the Folketing. The king's actions during the Easter crisis of 1920 sparked large demonstrations and political protests and were described by parts of the press as a coup d'etat. Some even began to talk about abolishing the monarchy altogether. The crisis subsided when, after intense negotiations, the king and political leaders agreed to appoint a new temporary government and call new elections. Since then, the monarchy has not intervened directly in politics. On point 9.4, Economic Crisis and Social Reforms. In 1917, The Bolsheviks, communists, took power in Russia, which was transformed into the Soviet Union. Fascism and Nazism gained ground, for example, in Italy, 1922, and Germany, 1933, and many other European countries developed authoritarian regimes during the 1920s and 1930s. All of this reflected a movement in a non-democratic direction. In Denmark, however, it proved possible to preserve democracy. At the same time, a very serious international economic event occurred during this period: the stock market crash on Wall Street in New York in October 1929. Share prices fell dramatically, and the economic crisis spread to the rest of the world. In Denmark, the country's largest industry, agriculture, was particularly hard hit by the crisis. Prices for grain and meat fell sharply. Thousands of farmers were forced to sell their farms because they were no longer earning enough money. Unemployment rose dramatically and reached over 30% in the early 1930s. In 1924, the cigar sorter Thorvald Stauning became Denmark's first social democratic prime minister. This government, which lasted for 2 years until 1926, also included the country's first female minister. Her name was Nina Bang, and she served as Minister of Education. In 1929, the Social Democratic Party formed a government again, this time together with the Social Liberal Party, Det Radikale Venstre. The government attempted to alleviate the crisis through various measures. On January 30th, 1933, coincidentally the same day Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, the government and the party Venstre entered into the so-called Kanzlergaard Agreement. It was given this name because the decisive negotiations took place in Prime Minister Thorvald Stauning's home on Kanzlergaard in Copenhagen. The Kanzlergaard Agreement was a far-reaching compromise that took into account both employers' and workers' interests. The agreement prevented wage cuts for workers, but banned strikes for 1 year. It was also necessary to support agriculture, which had been severely affected by the economic crisis. The agreement made it easier for farmers to borrow money so that they could avoid bankruptcy. At the same time, the Danish krone was devalued, meaning that its value was reduced. This made it easier to sell agricultural products to Great Britain. As part of the agreement, a so-called social reform was also implemented. This reform expanded the population's social rights and created more uniform rules for when individual citizens could receive financial assistance from the public sector, for example, as a result of unemployment or illness. 1.10 Denmark occupied by Germany, 1940 to 45. Hitler's attack on Poland in September 1939 led Great Britain and France to declare war on Germany. As a result, the Second World War broke out in Europe. Denmark was occupied by Germany from 1940 until the end of the war in 1945. Denmark cooperated with the Germans in order to ease the conditions of occupation, but during the war, a Danish resistance movement gradually emerged. At the same time, Denmark succeeded in rescuing the vast majority of the country's Jews from Nazi Germany's genocide, the Holocaust. 1.10.1 Occupation and collaboration. Denmark and Norway were attacked and occupied by the German military on April 9, 1940. Germany explained that it wanted to protect the two countries from British occupation. However, Germany's occupation of Denmark was primarily due to its interest in Norway. German warfare depended on supplies of iron ore from northern Sweden, which were to be shipped from the ice-free Norwegian Atlantic port of Narvik. The British had also shown interest in the supply of raw materials. In addition, Germany wanted to secure its access to the world's oceans via Norway's long coastline. Since Denmark lies between Norway and Germany, the Germans needed access to the airfield in Aalborg as an intermediate stop. Finally, Denmark's location on the North Sea made the country an indispensable part of Germany's defensive system against a potential Allied invasion of the European west coast. Early in the morning of April 9th, the attack began when German troops crossed the border in southern Jutland. Denmark's military resistance to the attack was insignificant and lasted only a few hours. As a result, only a small number of Danish soldiers lost their lives during the attack. Germany's military power was so overwhelming that the Danish government believed continued resistance would be futile. Germany demanded that Denmark cooperate with the occupying power, and Denmark reluctantly agreed. The Danish government was not dismissed but continued as a coalition government under social democratic leadership, though under German control. The king also remained as head of state. Formally, Denmark retained its status as a sovereign, neutral state, even though the country was occupied by German troops. For most Danes, at least during the first years of the occupation, daily life continued largely without major changes. On May 10th, 1940, 1 month after Denmark's surrender, France was also invaded by Germany and was defeated in less than 6 weeks. Britain was thus left almost alone in the fight against Hitler, and an Allied victory seemed far away. As the years passed, however, Germany's war effort encountered increasing difficulties, and more people began to believe in an Allied victory. 2 events in 1941 were decisive in this regard: Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, on June 22nd, and Japan, Germany's ally, bombing the American fleet at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii on December 7th. As a result, both the Soviet Union and the United States entered the war on the Allied side, and Germany now faced too many and too powerful enemies to be able to win the war in the long term. During the first years of the occupation, Denmark remained relatively calm despite the war, but from 1942, Danish resistance to the German presence in the country began to grow. The Germans believed that the Danish government was not doing enough to suppress this resistance or otherwise secure German interests in the country. After a major crisis in Danish-German relations in October 1942, a new government was formed at German demand under the leadership of Erik Scavenius, a former foreign minister and a strong advocate of the policy of cooperation with Germany. In August 1943, when it became increasingly clear that Germany would lose the war, major strikes broke out in several Danish cities as a result of increasingly harsh German demands. On August 29, 1943, the government decided to submit its resignation to the king after Scavenius had rejected German demands to intervene actively against the strikes and the growing resistance to the German occupation, including the German demand for the death penalty for sabotage. This marked the end of the Danish government's policy of cooperation with Nazi Germany. At the same time, the German occupying power dissolved the Danish military. In 1943, the Danish Navy scuttled most of its ships itself to prevent them from falling into German hands. After this, Denmark effectively had no government, even though the king had refused to accept the government's resignation. In practice, the country was thereafter governed by the permanent secretaries, that is, the highest administrative officials of the ministries. To some extent, and more informally, they continued coordination with the German occupying power in order to protect the population as much as possible, despite the new and more serious situation in the country. 1.10.2 The Rescue of the Danish Jews. In 1940, approximately 8,000 Jews lived in Denmark. More than 7,000 of them managed to escape Nazi persecution during the occupation. Most were helped to Sweden by fellow Danish citizens just before the Germans attempted to arrest Danish Jews in October 1943. Around 500 Danish Jews were, however, deported to concentration camps in Germany, where many perished. On a European scale, a very large proportion of Danish Jews survived this genocide, which is also known as the Holocaust. In total, Nazi Germany murdered 6 million of Europe's approximately 9 to 10 million Jews during the war, most of them through mass shootings or in gas chambers in extermination camps. 1.10.3 Iceland becomes independent. In 1944, Iceland finally broke away after 564 years under Danish rule. In the second half of the 19th century, a strong independence movement emerged in Iceland, which in 1918 gained extensive self-government through the so-called Act of Union, Forbundsloven, in a union, a personal union, with Denmark. This meant that the Danish king was also King of Iceland. Furthermore, Iceland's foreign and defense policy was handled by Denmark. During the Second World War, Iceland's geographical location in the middle of the northern Atlantic Ocean became highly significant. Aircraft and ships traveling from the United States to Europe could use the island as a base. For this reason, Great Britain occupied Iceland in May 1940 to prevent a German invasion. Later in the war, the United States took over the defense of Iceland. The Act of Union from 1918 expired in 1943, and Denmark, which was under German occupation, therefore had no real opportunity to renegotiate it. In a referendum, an almost unanimous Icelandic population decided in favor of full independence. The Republic of Iceland was thus proclaimed on June 17, 1944, which has since become Iceland's National Day. 1.10.4 Resistance and Liberation. The final years of the occupation were marked by an increasing number of acts of sabotage, both against the German military in Denmark and against Danes who collaborated with the occupying power. The Danish Freedom Council, Frihetsrådet, was established in September 1943. It was an illegal committee in which leaders from the various resistance movements coordinated resistance against the German occupiers. A major strike in Copenhagen in July 1944 led to increased contact between the resistance movement and politicians. After the strike, the Freedom Council and Danish politicians cooperated in an effort to have Denmark recognized as an allied country in the fight against Germany. However, the Soviet Union opposed this. In the spring of 1945, Nazi Germany collapsed after fierce fighting across Europe. On May 5th, Denmark was officially liberated by British forces after German troops had surrendered. On the island of Bornholm, however, the Germans refused to surrender. In the final days of the occupation, the island was therefore attacked by Soviet forces, which remained there until the spring of 1946. In total, approximately 7,000 Danes were killed during the Second World War, many of them sailors who served in Allied war service. Denmark was thus not hit as hard by the Second World War as many other European countries. With around 60 million deaths worldwide, the Second World War was the bloodiest conflict in world history, and the death toll was far higher in almost all other German-occupied countries. For example, the Netherlands lost around 200,000 citizens, and in Eastern Europe, where the war was far bloodier than in Western Europe, Poland alone lost 5 to 6 million citizens. The relatively low death toll and limited destruction in Denmark were due first to the rapid Danish surrender in April 1940 and the subsequent policy of cooperation with the Germans. Second, they were because the German troops in Denmark, apart from those on Bornholm, surrendered without fighting at the end of the war in 1945, even before Allied forces arrived in the country. As a result, the major battles between the great powers never reached Denmark. There was, however, a shortage of many goods in Denmark. To control consumption and ensure that scarce supplies were distributed to everyone, so-called rationing was introduced for items such as gasoline, gas, electricity, sugar, coffee, tea, flour, bread, soap, meat, and butter. This meant that each citizen could purchase only a limited amount of these goods. Several of the winters during the occupation were unusually cold, with temperatures dropping to minus 30 degrees Celsius, and the lack of fuel, such as oil and coal, made it difficult to heat homes, schools, and workplaces. Unlike in many other countries, however, there was never famine in Denmark. The political system also survived the war. The resistance movement gained some political influence in the period immediately after the liberation, but the old politicians and parties soon returned to power. 1.11 The Cold War, Welfare, and the Youth Revolt, 1945 to 72. Denmark changed greatly in the period after the Second World War. Denmark abandoned its traditional policy of neutrality and became a member of NATO in 1949. In domestic politics as well, the post-war period brought major changes, not least because of rapidly growing economic prosperity. Danes had more money at their disposal than ever before. Toward the end of the 1960s, disagreements between younger and older generations increased, as many young people began to question many of society's traditional norms. 1.11.1 Danish Politics and the Cold War. The world had changed after the Second World War. Millions of people had been killed during the war, and many cities in Europe lay in ruins. The war created a strong desire to ensure international peace and security. In 1945, a number of countries therefore founded the United Nations, UN. Denmark was a member of the UN from the very beginning. One of the organization's main aims was to help prevent a new world war. After the Second World War, the Cold War emerged between the two new superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. It was an ideological struggle and an arms race, particularly involving nuclear weapons, between the Western democracies based on a liberal market economy on the one hand, and the communist countries based on a planned economy on the other. Europe was divided into a West and an East, along a line that largely reflected which areas had been liberated from Nazi Germany during the Second World War by the United States and Great Britain in the West, and by the Soviet Union in the East. This division between East and West became known as the Iron Curtain. The Cold War shaped the world until the communist dictatorships in Eastern Europe collapsed around 1990. Since the English Wars at the beginning of the 19th century, Denmark had sought to remain neutral in international conflicts. However, because the policy of neutrality had failed to prevent the German occupation during the Second World War, Denmark chose a side in the Cold War. Denmark felt better protected as a member of the Defense Alliance, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. In 1949, Denmark therefore became a member of NATO. The alliance consisted of the United States, Canada, Turkey, and a number of Western European countries. Central to the NATO treaty is Article 5, the so-called Musketeer Oath. It states that an armed attack on one member country shall be considered an attack on all member countries. This obliges the other NATO members, if necessary also by military means, to assist the country that has been attacked. Opposing NATO was the Warsaw Pact, which was established in 1955. This defense alliance was led by the Communist Soviet Union, which gained great influence over the countries of Eastern Europe after the Second World War. After nearly 100 years under German influence, Denmark's foreign and security policy after the Second World War became particularly oriented toward the United States. The United States played an important role in the reconstruction of Western Europe after the Second World War. In the years 1948 to 1951, the United States provided very large sums of money to several Western European countries, including Denmark. The funds were given as part of the Marshall Plan, named after U.S. Secretary of State George Marshall. The purpose of Marshall Aid was to revive international trade, which had come to a standstill during the Second World War. In this way, it was also hoped to prevent the further spread of communism in Western Europe. The economic assistance from the United States helped modernize Danish agriculture in the first decades after the Second World War. Hundreds of thousands of horses were replaced by tractors, combine harvesters, and other machines. As a result, a large part of the rural workforce became redundant, and many people moved from the countryside to the cities during the 1950s. The first election after the war in 1945 resulted in a bourgeois government led by Venstre, but in 1947, the Social Democratic Party regained government power. The Communist Party of Denmark, DKP, received relatively strong support in the 1945 election, with 12.5% of the vote, because large segments of the population sympathized with the fact that many Danish communists had participated in the resistance during the occupation, and with the Soviet Union's significant role in defeating Nazi Germany. However, most of the party's new voters soon left again. The vast majority of voters continued to support the four established parties: the Social Democratic Party, the Social Liberal Party, Det Radikale Venstre, the Conservative People's Party, and Venstre. The Danish tradition of political stability and agreement on the basic democratic rules of the game continued during the Cold War. The Soviet-supported communists never gained a share of government power in Denmark. In the post-war period, discussions resumed about whether the constitution needed to be amended. In a referendum in 1953, a majority voted in favor of changing the constitution. The amendment meant, among other things, that the Landsting was abolished. Instead, a so-called unicameral system was introduced, with the Folketing as the sole legislative assembly. In addition, the constitution was extended to apply to Greenland and not only to Denmark and the Faroe Islands. The rules of succession to the throne were also changed so that the Danish throne could be inherited by a woman. Sons still took precedence over daughters, meaning that a younger son would inherit the throne even if he had an older sister. The issue of female succession became particularly pressing because the reigning king, Frederick IX, 1947 to 1972, had 3 daughters and no sons. The constitutional amendment of 1953 thus made it possible for his eldest daughter, later Queen Margrethe II, 1972 to 2024, to inherit the throne. With a change to the Act of Succession in 2009, men and women were given completely equal rights of succession to the throne, so that it is always the eldest child, son or daughter, who inherits the throne. The Social Democratic Party held the greatest political influence in the first decades after the Second World War. From 1953 to 1968, all Danish governments were led by the Social Democrats. The only party founded during this period that is still represented in the Folketing today is SF, the Socialist People's Party. SF was founded in 1959 by a group of people who left the DKP in protest against the communist country's oppression of their populations, oppression that the defectors believed the DKP did not sufficiently condemn. The suppression of the popular uprising against communist rule in Hungary in 1956 was of decisive importance for the split within the DKP. 1.11.2 Greater welfare. From the late 1950s, Europe, including Denmark, experienced strong economic growth. In the period 1957 to 1973, Denmark enjoyed an economic boom almost without parallel in the country's history. There was full employment and a large increase in production, and most incomes rose steadily during this period. The era is therefore often referred to as the Happy 60s. From the beginning of the 1960s, Denmark exported more goods from industry than from agriculture. It was also during this period that the construction of the Danish welfare state truly began, and an ever larger social safety net was extended beneath the population. Several of the schemes that form the foundation of today's Danish welfare state were established during these years, and many existing schemes were significantly expanded. For example, the state pension, folk pension, which grants every citizen the right to a pension regardless of income, was introduced in 1956. In 1964, the Folketing decided that municipalities were required to establish the necessary number of childcare places so that all families would have the opportunity to place their children in nurseries and kindergartens. The expansion of the welfare state also meant that taxes and duties increased significantly during this period. Economic growth also meant that more labor was needed. Many Danish women entered the labor market. In the mid-20th century, most married women had taken care of the home and children, while men worked outside the home. From the 1960s onward, women increasingly gained education and employment. As a result, many more children spent part of the day in one of the many new nurseries, kindergartens, and after-school centers that were established. However, women often received lower pay than men for the same work, and the struggle to ensure equality between men and women grew stronger. The economic growth meant that many more people suddenly gained access to consumer goods beyond the most necessities, such as food, clothing, and housing. Television sets, record players, refrigerators, freezers, washing machines, single-family houses, cars, and more had previously been considered luxury goods that only the wealthiest could afford. Now they have increasingly become part of everyday life for most people. In addition to rising prosperity, the working week was gradually shortened from 48 to 40 hours between 1958 and 1974, and people were granted more vacation time, from 2 to 4 weeks between 1953 and 1972. As a result, many more people now have the time and financial means to travel abroad on holiday or buy a summer house. 1.11.3 The Youth Revolt and New Cultural Trends. In the late 1960s, Denmark, like many other Western countries, experienced clear tensions between generations. Young people's opposition to society's norms and authorities grew, and as a result, they rebelled. Many young people, especially in the larger cities, broke with traditional social norms and values. Among other things, they questioned the United States' involvement in the Vietnam War and the nuclear family with father, mother, and children as the fundamental unit of society. Instead, a freer attitude towards sexual relationships emerged, including relationships before marriage. From 1966, birth control pills could be sold legally in Denmark. Women thus gained access to an easy method of contraception, allowing them to decide for themselves whether they wanted to become pregnant and have children. The pill, therefore, had decisive importance for women's sexual liberation. New ways of living together also became more accepted. For example, couples could live together and have children without being married. Some young people sought new ways of communal living, including in shared housing communities, collectives. Others experimented with narcotic drugs. The free town of Christiania in Copenhagen was established in 1971, when young people occupied an abandoned military barracks, Bådsmandsstræde Barracks. After that, up to around 1,000 people settled in Christiania and tried to live out many of the new ideas of the time. The free town of Christiania still exists today. The youth revolt also led to a student revolt. In 1968 and the years that followed, many students and younger lecturers rebelled against the so-called professor rule at the universities. They demanded greater influence, new forms of leadership and teaching, and different academic content, and they succeeded in having many of their demands met. The stricter and more authoritarian upbringing of children in families and schools was also replaced by an educational approach based on increased dialogue and cooperation between children and adults. Among other things, it became completely forbidden in 1967 for teachers to physically punish pupils in Danish primary schools. However, it was not until 30 years later, in 1997, that it also became completely illegal for parents to physically punish their own children. On point 12, Denmark in Europe and the oil crisis, 1972 to 90. In 1973, Denmark became a member of the European Communities, EC, the predecessor of today's European Union, EU. In the early 1970s, after many years of strong economic growth, Denmark, like many other countries, was hit by an economic crisis. The 1970s and 1980s became a period for Denmark marked by low economic growth as well as the emergence of new political parties and movements. 1.12.1 Denmark's membership of the EC. In 1958, France, Italy, Germany, and the Benelux countries, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, began an economic cooperation that developed into the European Communities, EC, and later into the European Union, EU. The purpose of the EC was to strengthen trade between the member states and to secure peace through close cooperation. Therefore, a common market was to be established among the EC countries, without customs barriers or other obstacles to internal trade. The goal was also that all citizens should be free to seek and take work in other EC countries. On January 1st, 1973, Denmark joined the EC. A majority of 63.3% of voters had said yes to membership in a referendum in October 1972. In the run-up to the vote, there was extensive debate about the EC issue. Supporters believed that Denmark would become wealthier by participating in European economic cooperation. First, it was expected that Denmark's most important trading partner at the time, Great Britain, would also join the EC together with Denmark. Furthermore, supporters wanted to secure the best possible opportunities to trade in the European market, especially the German market, whose importance to the Danish economy had grown significantly in the preceding years. In addition, it was considered an advantage to ensure Danish agriculture access to the EC's agricultural subsidies. Opponents were against Denmark giving up some of its right to self-determination and feared that the large countries would come to dominate decision-making and that membership would undermine public welfare and Danish national identity. Considerations of exports and the economy proved decisive for Denmark's yes vote. Great Britain and Ireland became members of the EC at the same time as Denmark. In 1986, a new referendum was held on strengthening cooperation within the EC. The referendum concerned the Single European Act, known in Denmark as the EC package. Its purpose was to establish an internal market in which goods, people, services, and capital could move freely across borders between member states. A majority of Danes, 56.2%, voted yes. 1.12.2 The oil crisis. In 1974, Denmark, like many other Western countries, was hit by an economic crisis. It was triggered by a sharp rise in oil prices in 1973. The background was that the Arab countries significantly increased the price of oil to put pressure on Western countries that supported Israel in a war against Egypt and Syria, the Yom Kippur War. Oil was absolutely crucial to the economy as it was used in most industries, for cars and for heating homes. At that time, Denmark produced very little oil itself and therefore had to purchase it abroad. As a result, the price increase caused serious problems in Denmark, which already had a trade deficit with foreign countries. The high economic growth of the preceding years declined sharply, and many people became unemployed. The problems were worsened and prolonged when another sharp rise in oil prices occurred in 1979 to 80 due to unrest in Iran in connection with the Islamic Revolution and the subsequent war between Iran and Iraq. During the 1980s, oil prices fell again because more oil was extracted outside the Middle East, for example, in the North Sea, and because part of the world's oil consumption was replaced by other forms of energy, such as natural gas, coal, nuclear power, and to a much smaller extent, renewable energy sources like wind power or solar energy. Furthermore, the oil crisis helped create interest in energy-saving measures, such as better insulation of buildings and the development of cars and electronics, including television sets, refrigerators, and freezers, that use energy more efficiently. On point 12.3. Political breakthrough. The 1970s were also a period of major political change in Denmark. Many voters protested against high taxes and the bureaucracy that had accompanied the large public sector in the welfare state, and voters developed greater distrust of politicians. At the parliamentary election in 1973, voters suddenly voted very differently than before. There was a major shift in voter behavior, and this election is therefore known as the landslide election, Jordskredsvalget. The Social Democratic Party, the Social Liberal Party, Det Radikale Venstre, Venstre, the Conservative People's Party, and SF, the five parties represented in the Folketing at the time, all received far fewer votes. Before the landslide election, 93% of voters had voted for one of these five parties. After the election, this figure had fallen to just 64%. Instead, voters elected five additional parties to the Folketing, the largest of which was the protest party, the Progress Party, Fremskrittspartiet, which received 16% of the vote under the leadership of lawyer Mogens Glistrup. The party's main policies were the abolition of income tax and public bureaucracy. Over the following years, many voters gradually returned to the old parties, and none of the new parties elected in 1973 are represented in the Folketing today. Nevertheless, the landslide election is a milestone in Danish political history, not least because since then, between 7 and 12 parties have typically been elected to the Folketing at each election, instead of the usual 5 to 6 before 1973. Although new parties have continuously emerged, it has always been politicians from either the Social Democratic Party, the Social Liberal Party, the Conservative People's Party, or Venstre who have served as Prime Minister in Denmark since the system change of 1901. During the 1970s, successive Danish governments tried to reverse the economic downturn, but with little success. At the beginning of the 1980s, Denmark had a large deficit on the balance of trade. That is, the relationship between the value of what Denmark bought and sold abroad. At the same time, around 10% of the workforce was unemployed. One important cause of the economic crisis was a large foreign debt. The Social Democratic Party had, with only brief interruptions, been in government and held the post of prime minister for most of the time since 1929. However, in 1982, due to difficulties in solving the economic problems, they handed over government power to the non-socialist bourgeois parties without a parliamentary election. The new prime minister was the conservative Paul Schlüter, who remained in office for more than 10 years until 1993. Paul Schlüter is the first and so far only prime minister from the Conservative People's Party. This is because Venstre has been the largest non-socialist party for most of the time since the system change of 1901, and has therefore usually held the prime minister's office when non-socialist governments have been in power. The change of government in 1982 is also a historical milestone, because since then, the non-socialist parties have most often been in power. In the period 1982 to 2022, the non-socialist parties, Venstre, and the Conservative People's Party together held government office and the prime minister's post for a total of 24 years, while the Social Democratic Party held it for a total of 16 years. Over time, the Schlüter government succeeded in improving the Danish economy, especially in the latter half of the 1980s. The price was record-high unemployment in the early 1990s. However, inflation, rising prices, which had been a major problem in the 1970s, declined, and from 1990, Denmark recorded a surplus on the balance of trade with foreign countries. This made it possible for healthy economic growth to resume. In this context, it also helped that Denmark became more self-sufficient in oil from the North Sea. The Schlüter government also abolished DR's monopoly, that is, its exclusive right, to broadcast Danish television, which DR had held since the first Danish TV broadcast in 1948. In 1986, it was therefore permitted for private individuals to own television channels, and in the same year, the Folketing decided to establish TV2, which began broadcasting in 1988. In the following years, the number of radio and television channels in Denmark grew significantly, and cable and satellite television with many foreign channels became a substantial part of the Danish media landscape. 1.12.4 Social movements. After women began entering the labor market from the mid-1960s, many women in the 1970s consequently demanded greater equality. For example, women in the Red Stocking movement in Rødstrømpevægelsen fought through political actions for better conditions for women. Throughout the 1970s, gender equality was a highly prominent political issue. In 1976, the Folketing passed a law on equal pay for equal work based on an EC directive. Free access to abortion was another political goal of the women's movement. Previously, abortion had only been possible if there was a special reason, for example, consideration for the woman's health. But in 1973, the Folketing decided that Danish women themselves should be able to choose whether to terminate a pregnancy. Up until the 12th week of pregnancy, women were given the right to have an abortion. Opposition to free abortion was a significant reason for the formation of the Christian People's Party, Kristeligt Folkeparti, now called the Christian Democrats, which was elected to the Folketing in 1973. However, free abortion still applies, and in 2025, the limit for free abortion was raised from the 12th to the 18th week of pregnancy. Several grassroots movements were very active in the 1970s. Grassroots movements were usually groups that worked to achieve one specific political goal. The peace movement was active during this period and worked, among other things, against military rearmament and the arms race between the great powers. Thousands of Danes also demonstrated against nuclear power. This popular opposition was an important reason why the Folketing decided in 1985 to plan Denmark's future energy supply without nuclear power. In particular, a serious accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in the Soviet Union, in present-day Ukraine, the following year, in 1986, had great significance for the lasting opposition to nuclear power. In recent years, similar movements have re-emerged alongside the increasing political focus on climate issues. Among others, many upper secondary school students, often inspired by the Swedish activist Greta Thunberg, have gone on strike to demand stronger action to counter climate change. 1.13 Denmark in the Global Society, 1990 to present. Since 1990, Danish history has been shaped by globalization. The Berlin Wall and the Iron Curtain fell, and new conflicts broke out. The fight against terrorism has also left its mark on the world and on Denmark, which has taken on a new and more active role in international affairs. The EC expanded its political cooperation and was renamed the European Union, EU, but the Danish population adopted the new EU only hesitantly. The country's economic situation, though interrupted by a financial crisis in 2008, improved again, and issues related to integrating refugees and immigrants into society increasingly came into focus. In 2020, a global health crisis struck with COVID-19. 1.13.1 Denmark in the New Europe. Around 1990, the communist system in Eastern Europe collapsed. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991 marked the end of the Cold War. This led to major changes in Europe. Central and Eastern European countries that had previously been behind the Iron Curtain now moved politically closer to Western Europe. Denmark developed close relations, especially with the three Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. After the Cold War, new conflicts broke out, among other places in Iraq and the former Yugoslavia. From this point on, Denmark increasingly took an active role in international conflicts and became involved in several wars. After Iraq occupied Kuwait in 1990, Denmark sent a warship to help enforce the international community's trade blockade against Iraq. Yugoslavia was dissolved in 1991 to 1992. In its place, a number of independent states emerged, which quickly came into conflict with one another. Danish soldiers were deployed as UN peacekeeping forces in Bosnia and Croatia in the mid-1990s, where they were to help create peace between the warring parties. Kosovo, which at the time was a province of Yugoslavia, was also affected by the conflict in 1999. Here, Danish fighter jets took part in NATO's operations. Denmark's relationship with European cooperation was marked by political disagreement during the 1990s. In 1992, the 12 member states agreed to expand cooperation, and the EC changed its name to the EU, the European Union. The change of name reflected the fact that cooperation, which had previously focused on economic issues such as trade, agriculture, and fisheries, was expanded to include a broader range of political policy areas. A majority in the Folketing supported Denmark's participation in the expanded cooperation. However, according to the Constitution, a referendum was required. In June 1992, a narrow majority of the population, 50.7%, voted no to the Maastricht Treaty, as the Union Agreement was called, because it had been concluded in the city of Maastricht in the Netherlands. In 1993, a majority of the population, 56.7%, voted yes to the so-called Edinburgh Agreement, which meant that Denmark obtained 4 so-called opt-outs from the EU. This meant that Denmark did not participate in EU cooperation in the following 4 areas: EU citizenship, the common currency, the euro, defense policy, and cooperation on a common legal and immigration policy. 2 of these opt-outs still apply today. As a result, Denmark has, for example, retained its own national currency, the krone, whereas most EU countries use the common currency, the euro. Denmark also does not participate in the EU's common legal and immigration policy. Opposition to the EU among parts of the population was also one of the reasons why the Red-Green Alliance, Enhedslisten, a coalition of several smaller left-wing parties, was elected to the Folketing for the first time in 1994. Despite the EU opt-outs, a clear majority of the Danish population has a positive attitude toward Denmark's membership of the EU. On point 13.2, Economic Upswing and Debates on Immigration. In 1993, the Social Democratic Party returned to power with Poul Nyrup Rasmussen as the new prime minister. The economic problems Denmark had experienced in the 1970s and 1980s were followed by an economic recovery. In the mid-1990s, economic growth increased again, and more people found employment. In addition, the production of oil and gas from Danish fields in the North Sea meant that Denmark gradually achieved a net export of oil. This contributed to a growing surplus on the balance of trade, and Denmark's foreign debt was gradually reduced. During the 1990s, the debate about immigration to Denmark increasingly filled the political agenda. The number of people with an immigrant background had risen significantly in the preceding decades, and in larger Danish cities, neighborhoods had emerged where many residents had an ethnic background other than Danish. At the same time, many refugees and immigrants found it difficult to obtain education and employment. The issue of integration received considerable political attention during this period, among other reasons, because relatively many people with a foreign background in Denmark performed poorly in the education system, and because a relatively large proportion were unemployed and received social benefits such as cash assistance and disability pensions. Many Danes also believed that some immigrants had cultures very different from Danish culture and were not sufficiently proficient in learning the Danish language. The desire among many Danes for stricter immigration and integration policies played a major role in the Danish People's Party, led by its founder and party leader Pia Kjærsgaard, born 1947, being elected to the Folketing for the first time in 1998. The Danish People's Party helped make immigration policy a key issue in parliamentary elections in the following decades. Other political parties gradually took up the issue as well. In 2001, the non-socialist parties regained government power. The prime minister became Anders Fogh Rasmussen from Venstre. Discussions about immigration and integration continued, and the new government implemented several tightening measures in immigration policy. The aim was to limit parts of immigration, get more people into work, and improve integration. Some subsequent governments have introduced further tightening of immigration policy. For example, a requirement was introduced that individuals must have resided in Denmark for a longer period and have worked before being eligible for full cash assistance benefits. In addition, foreigners must have lived longer in Denmark to obtain Danish citizenship and must meet requirements regarding employment and self-support. Furthermore, they must not have committed serious crimes and must pass a number of tests in the Danish language, as well as in Danish history, society, culture, and values. It has also become more difficult to bring a spouse from abroad to Denmark. Among other things, both spouses must be at least 24 years old, the so-called 24-year rule, and meet a number of requirements concerning, for example, employment, self-support, education, housing, and Danish language skills. The purpose is to ensure the best possible starting conditions for the successful integration of the spouse who comes to Denmark. However, not everyone has agreed with the stricter immigration policy. Opponents have criticized, among other things, that lower economic benefits increase poverty and that stricter requirements for family reunification divide families and have made it too difficult also for Danish citizens to bring a spouse to the country. 1.13.3 Denmark in international conflicts. The international community changed rapidly at the beginning of the new millennium. The global economy and international terrorism presented Denmark with new challenges. After the terrorist attacks on the United States on September 11, 2001, the fight against terrorism became an important task in most countries. This led in particular to increased cooperation between intelligence services, but also to military interventions in which Denmark participated actively. Behind the attacks on the United States in 2001 were terrorists operating from Afghanistan in cooperation with the Afghan regime at the time. In 2002, the Folketing decided to send Danish soldiers to Afghanistan to take part in a US-led operation. In 2003, the United States invaded Iraq to remove the Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein and Iraq's alleged weapons of mass destruction. Once again, Denmark's government supported the effort and sent Danish troops. One of Denmark's greatest foreign policy crises in recent times developed after the newspaper Jyllands-Posten published 12 caricature drawings of the Muslim prophet Muhammad in 2005. The newspaper printed the drawings because it had heard that some artists did not dare to draw Muhammad out of fear of being assaulted or killed. The cartoons led to large protests, both in Denmark and abroad. In many Muslim countries, there were major demonstrations in which, among other things, the Danish flag, Dannebrog, was burned, and in some places in Syria and Lebanon, Danish embassies and consulates were also set on fire. A number of countries also boycotted Danish products because of the cartoons. In 2008, Jyllands-Posten was acquitted in a defamation lawsuit brought by several Muslim organizations. However, the debate about freedom of expression did not end there. In 2010, one of the cartoonists was the target of an attempted murder in his home. In 2015, Denmark was hit by a terrorist attack in Copenhagen when a man who sympathized with the terrorist organization Islamic State shot and killed a filmmaker while he was participating in a debate meeting on art, blasphemy, and freedom of expression in the Østerbro district. Later the same day, the terrorist attempted to enter the Jewish synagogue in central Copenhagen. During the attack, a Jewish security guard was shot and killed outside the synagogue. The terrorist himself was later killed in a shootout with the police. On point 13.4, from financial crisis to a new economic upswing. After around 15 years of economic growth and progress, Denmark was hit by the international financial crisis in 2008. The crisis began in the United States, but quickly spread to Europe, where it became deeper and longer lasting than in the US. This was also the case in Denmark, where gross domestic product, that is, the value of the country's total production, shrank by more than 5% in total in 2008 to 2009. This was the largest setback for the Danish economy since the Second World War. The crisis was followed by several years of higher unemployment. When the crisis struck, unemployment was at its lowest level in 30 years, and there was a large surplus on the state budget. This was turned into a deficit, but Denmark nevertheless did not experience problems with public deficits and debt to the same extent as most other EU countries. At the same time, Denmark's foreign debt has been transformed into a large net asset position, meaning that other countries owe Denmark more money than Denmark owes them. In addition, the surplus on the balance of trade has repeatedly set records over the past 20 years, amounting to approximately 386 billion Danish kroner in 2024. Since the mid-2010s, Denmark has once again experienced higher economic growth, surpluses in public finances, and lower unemployment. In 2024, the Danish state's revenues were thus 133 billion kroner, higher than its expenditures. Unemployment was 2.9% in April 2025, compared with 6.0% in April 2013. 1.13.5 Challenges of the welfare state. In 2009, Anders Fogh Rasmussen was elected Secretary General of the Defense Alliance NATO. He was succeeded as Prime Minister by his party colleague Lars Løkke Rasmussen. 2 years later, in 2011, the Social Democrats returned to power, and Helle Thorning-Schmidt became Denmark's first female Prime Minister, serving for the next 4 years until 2015, when Lars Løkke Rasmussen once again became Prime Minister. The challenge of moving more people from welfare benefits into employment has been a driving force behind numerous Danish welfare reforms over the past 30 to 35 years. Both the governments led by Lars Løkke Rasmussen and Helle Thorning-Schmidt spearheaded many such reforms. One of the greatest long-term challenges facing the welfare state in European countries is that there are fewer people to pay for the welfare that more people are expected to benefit from. This is primarily because people, on average, are living longer. As in other Western countries, life expectancy increases by a few months each year, and this trend is expected to continue. At the same time, birth rates have fallen, while expectations regarding the quality of elderly care and the healthcare system have risen. This means that there will be significantly more elderly people relative to the number of 15 to 64-year-olds, and fewer people to work and pay for welfare. At the same time, working life begins later due to longer education. Overall, there is a shortage of labor in many parts of the Danish labor market, even though there are still unemployed people. As a result, many different reforms have aimed to increase the labor supply in order to get more people into work, earning income, and paying taxes. In this context, the period during which unemployed individuals can receive benefits from an unemployment insurance fund, A-kasse, has been gradually shortened since the 1990s, and since the most recent reform in 2010, it has been limited to 2 years. The so-called early retirement reform, Tilbagetrækningsreformen, of 2011 was intended to ensure a faster and larger increase in the typical age at which people retire from the labor market. In addition, reforms agreed upon in 2012 and 2013 were designed to ensure that fewer people receive disability pensions and that fewer rely on cash assistance. A number of tax reforms have also had the explicit goal of increasing the labor supply by lowering taxes on earned income. Through a series of reforms, students have likewise been encouraged to begin their studies earlier and complete them more quickly. 1.13.6 Health Crisis. A major challenge in the years 2020 to 2022 was a global pandemic involving COVID-19, which was caused by the so-called coronavirus. The virus was discovered in China in 2019. In Denmark, the first case was registered in February 2020. The government, the Folketing, the Danish Health Authority, and others attempted to contain the disease through a series of recommendations and restrictions. These were intended to ensure, for example, that people did not meet too many others, that they kept their distance from one another, and that they sanitized their hands. A key purpose of the restrictions was to prevent too many people from being infected at the same time, so that hospitals would not be overwhelmed by large numbers of admissions. As a result, people were required to wear face masks on buses, trains, and in shops, among other places. Travel between Denmark and other countries was also more restricted than usual. Schools were closed during certain periods, and students were taught from home via the internet. In addition, many restaurants, cafes, museums, and theaters were closed for periods of time. Football matches and other sports events took place without spectators, and many people worked from home. The healthcare system tested thousands of people daily to identify those who were infected, who were then required to stay at home for a period of time so they would not infect others. The coronavirus mutated, changed several times into increasingly contagious variants, and the disease has so far affected the country in 3 major waves. An important long-term measure to combat the disease was vaccination of the population. It took only about 1 year from the outbreak of the disease to develop vaccines against the coronavirus, and in December 2020, the first Dane was vaccinated. Since then, most people, around 90% of Denmark's population, have been vaccinated with 2 or 3 doses. Globally, nearly 7 million deaths associated with coronavirus were recorded, including almost 10,000 in Denmark. 1.13.7 New Political Realignment. In recent years, several new parties have emerged in Danish politics. 5 of these, Liberal Alliance, the Alternative, New Right, the Denmark Democrats, and the Moderates, are represented in the current Folketing. Liberal Alliance was elected to the Folketing for the first time in 2011. The party emerged with a platform calling for tax cuts, stronger economic incentives to work, lower public spending, and a greater role for the private market economy. The Alternative has emphasized, among other things, a stronger focus on green issues. The party argues that more should be done to protect the climate, nature, and the environment. The Alternative was elected to the Folketing for the first time in 2015. A third new party is New Right, Nye Borgerlig, which was elected to the Folketing for the first time in 2019. The New Right believes that too many refugees have come to Denmark and that too many of them rely on public benefits instead of being employed. In addition, the New Right advocates lower taxes and public spending cuts, including on foreign aid and public bureaucracy. In addition, 2 parties, the Denmark Democrats and the Moderates, were formed shortly before the parliamentary election in 2022. Both were founded by politicians who had previously been leading members of the party Venstre. The Denmark Democrats were founded by former Minister for Immigration and Integration Inger Støjberg. The party is critical of immigration to Denmark. Furthermore, the Denmark Democrats emphasize improving opportunities for people living in more sparsely populated parts of the country, particularly in large areas of Jutland. The Moderates were founded by former Prime Minister and party leader Lars Løkke Rasmussen. The party advocates a government across the center, involving both the Social Democrats and center-right parties. After the parliamentary election in 2019, Social Democrat Mette Frederiksen became Prime Minister at the head of a minority government consisting solely of the Social Democratic Party, with the Social Liberal Party, the Socialist People's Party, and the Red-Green Alliance serving as supporting parties. Another parliamentary election was held in 2022, in which many voters cast their ballots differently than they had in the previous election in 2019. The 7 oldest parties in the Folketing, the Social Democratic Party, Venstre, the Socialist People's Party, the Conservative People's Party, the Red-Green Alliance, and the Danish People's Party, together received 66% of the votes, significantly less than the 88% they had received in 2019. Nearly 1 in 3 voters, 32%, voted for the 5 newest parties. Liberal Alliance, New Right, and the Alternative all gained support. In addition, The Denmark Democrats and the moderates were elected for the first time, with 8 and 9% of the votes, respectively. Following the 2022 election, a majority government was formed with Mette Frederiksen as Prime Minister, consisting of the Social Democratic Party, Venstre, and the moderates. Since the election, several members of the Folketing have left the party under which they were elected. Many have joined new parties, while others are now unaffiliated and have become so-called independent members. For example, the New Right has lost all 6 of its members and is therefore no longer represented in the Folketing,